Good afternoon. Hello. May we please be seated so we can start? Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nina Arkeiruz, and I'm IDC's Director of Media and Communications. And I'm being told to speak louder. Thank you all for joining us at IDC's National Advocacy Convention, Beyond Genocide, Preserving Christianity in the Middle East. Last year, this week, Genocide Resolution 75 got introduced and then passed through our work. This year, we are beyond genocide to see what should we do to preserve Christianity in the Middle East. At the end of this session or throughout, please feel free to reach out to me or to Melissa Nix, Melissa over here, for press questions and inquiries. Many of you know us by face or email or names. You've received our press releases and emails, so we'll be helping you out. And without further delay, I'd like to introduce IDC Executive Director, Ms. Kirsten Evans, to lead on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ninar. Just to reiterate, Ninar is our Director of Media and Communications, and she's available for any media questions, as well as Melissa Nix, who's in the back. So thank you very much. Members of the press, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Board of Trustees, the Board of Advisors, staff, and members of In Defense of Christians, I welcome you to the official opening of our 2016 National Advocacy Convention. In Defense of Christians is the only organization of its kind dedicated entirely to the protection and preservation of Christians and Christianity in the Middle East. 1 year ago, at our 2015 National Leadership Convention, Congressman Jeff Fortenberry publicly announced the introduction of House Con Resolution 75, or the Genocide Resolution, which called upon the United States to recognize the treatment of Christians, Yazidis, and other religious minorities under ISIS as genocide, an attempt to eradicate these communities and their living memory of their cultural heritage from the land, simply because of their ethno-religious identity. In the months that followed, IDC, in collaboration with many other of our partner organizations, many of whom are represented here today, have worked tirelessly to educate the American people and our nation's leaders on the truth and the significance of that designation. In March of this year, in partnership with the Knights of Columbus, we submitted to the Secretary of State, John Kerry, and members of Congress a nearly 300-page report chronicling the evidence of the genocide against Christians, against the Christian community, which was taking place under ISIS. Within 1 week, the United States Congress made a historic unanimous vote in favor of the Genocide Resolution, and Secretary of State John Kerry officially acknowledged the same. This year's conference, taking place 1 year later from that historic event in which Jeff Fortenberry publicly introduced that resolution, is titled Beyond Genocide, Preserving Christianity in the Middle East. It is a regathering a year later to ask and answer the following questions. What can the United States and the international community do to support the communities that are being targeted for genocide? How can we help to ensure that the ancient Christian communities of Iraq and Syria, whose vibrant presence dates back to the 1st century AD, are able to survive and flourish as integrated members within their societies and in their own ancestral homelands? And more broadly, how can we help to ensure that the centuries-old Christian communities throughout the Middle East continue to live, worship, and flourish as contributing citizens, free to offer the robust social goods of education, healthcare, economic vitality, and civic engagement that has historically marked their presence? It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you on that topic our first speaker, Dr. Katrina Lantos Sweat. Dr. Sweat is the president and CEO of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice and the former chair of the United States Commission of International Religious Freedom. Dr. Sweat's lifetime commitment to human rights and religious freedom have made her a vocal activist on this issue and a dear friend of IDC's. We welcome you back, Dr. Sweat, and we thank you for your contribution to this cause.
Good afternoon. It is a pleasure and an honor for me to be here with all of you today. And really over the next few days, I think we are going to be further educated and guided from a range of policy experts and faith leaders and from each other as we explore the crucial question of if and how Christianity will continue in the land of its birth. It is obviously a vital question, and it is my prayer that at the end of these 2 days of this very important conference, and by the way, I want to commend you on calling the conference Beyond Genocide, because there has been far too much of a history of sort of declaring something and then everybody packing up their tents and going home and assuming that somehow having named the evil that is out there, we have done our job. And clearly that is not the case. So I very much welcome the call to action implied in the title of this conference. As I say, it is my prayer that at the conclusion of this very important conference, we will have a clearer sense of the way forward and the path ahead. But in my very brief remarks today, I would like to address this from a somewhat different perspective, because I am convinced that the answer to the question of whether or not the Christian communities of the Middle East will survive and will thrive hinges on how each of us answer a much more personal question, not a big question of history and the movements of armies and the forces of governments and powers, but a very personal question. And to put that question in front of you, I'm going to share a story, a true story, from my very early days as a young lawyer working on Capitol Hill. I'm now a distinguished mother of 7, grandmother of 4, soon to be grandmother of 5, any day now. So if my phone rings, I'll ignore it, but it might be welcome news about the arrival of our 5th grandchild. But back then, I was a newly minted young lawyer working for then Senator Joe Biden as deputy counsel on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And I'm happy to say there was a young man who was pursuing me. Always a good feeling, you know, that you've caught someone's eye. And this particular young man actually had the single most creative, if you will, pickup line that I was ever on the receiving end of. One day, as we were grabbing a bite to eat in one of the big cafeterias, he said, "I'm going to ask you a question. I want you to think about the answer to this question, and then I want you to tell me the answer when we go out on a date." So it was pretty clever. You know, he was setting it up quite well. And the question the scenario he posed to me was as follows. He said, imagine that tonight, when you get ready to go to bed, suddenly your room begins to fill with light until it's bathed in light. And in the midst of that heavenly light, you hear the voice of God. And he says to you, Katrina, I will answer any one question that you have of me, but only one. What would you ask? Well, it was a good question. It was one I found myself thinking about and pondering, and my initial instinct, of course, was to ask the big questions. How do we end poverty? How do we wipe out disease? How do we stop all wars? Those terrible crises of the world that are ever with us and all around us. And as I thought about using my one precious question to ask those queries, I thought a little further, and I felt that we probably already know the answer to those questions. We simply lack the will. We lack the courage. We lack the moral conviction to act upon answers that are probably not that mysterious, that are out there. And so I decided instead that I would ask a very personal question. And the question I concluded I would ask God if I had that opportunity was as follows. and I actually kind of turned it into 2 questions, hoping God wouldn't notice. And that question was, what will be the great moral challenge, the greatest moral challenge of my life, and will I be equal to it? Now, I want to say to everybody in this room today, I believe the threat to the Christian communities, the original, ancient, noble Christian communities, the threat, the danger, the risk of annihilation and elimination that they face, that they are facing now as we are here, is perhaps the great moral challenge of our time right now, the time that we are living in. And we are not meeting it. We are not proving ourselves equal to it. I will confess that I am baffled and heartbroken as the daughter of Holocaust survivors at how it is possible for the West to seem so blind, willfully blind, or even worse, aware but relatively disinterested in what is unfolding in our time, on our watch, in our purview of being able to act. You know, as many of you know, I am the daughter of the late Congressman Tom Lantos, and my father was the only survivor of the Holocaust ever elected to serve in the United States Congress. And I remember as a young girl, before my dad was really elected to Congress, our family's sort of growing social awareness and consciousness of the need for the American Jewish community during the 60s and the 70s to stand in solidarity with the Jewish communities of the Soviet Union, the so-called refuseniks. Maybe some of you are old enough, I see nodding heads, to remember the refusnik movement. And those were Jews who were ostracized. They were not facing genocide as the Christians of the Middle East face it today, but they were marginalized within their society and refused the right to emigrate from that society. And I think in part out of a deep sense of moral responsibility and a deep awareness of the failure to have mobilized the world on behalf of their brethren during the horrors of the Holocaust, the Jewish community really did mobilize in an extraordinary way to force this issue, the plight of the Soviet dissidents, the plight of the Soviet Jews, onto the sort of top of mind, above the fold awareness of political leaders, of the media, of the social community. And in point of fact, through a variety of mechanisms, legislative mechanisms such as the Jackson-Vanik Amendment and boycotts and full-page letters in the New York Times, you know, our tools then were less ubiquitous than in our day of social media. This issue was not permitted to be pushed to the side, to be pushed off the front pages. And in point of fact, results were achieved. We are not yet, with the exception of IDC and others of you represented here today, we are not seeing a similar urgent and coordinated effort on the part of the truly tens of millions of people in the West and specifically in the United States who should be shouting this cause from the mountaintop. And so, privileged as I am to be the first one to speak today, I guess my remarks really are that personal call to action. What is the great moral crisis of your life, of my life, of our day, of our time, and are we being equal to it? Because at the end of the day, for those of us who are believers, we know we will have to answer that question. We know we will personally be called upon to answer the question found in the very earliest chapters of Scripture. Am I my brother's keeper? Cain asked that question seeking to evade responsibility, but it has echoed down through the millennia. Am I my brother's keeper? And we dare not give any answer other than the affirmative. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sweat. There's something very moving and very compelling about receiving a call to action from someone who has spent their life dedicated to ensuring the human rights of all of her brothers and sisters around the world. So thank you for your testimony. Thank you for your work and your witness. Thank you for your words. It's very inspiring. I'd like to invite to the podium Congressman Dave Trott, who has just recently arrived to be with us this afternoon. Congressman Trott is from the 11th District of Michigan, and he represents a robust community of Americans of Middle Eastern Christian heritage living within his district, and he has been a dedicated advocate of their cause. So, Congressman Trott, thank you for joining us today.
Good afternoon. After arriving and listening to Dr. Lantos Sweat's story about dating, I became a little concerned about my topic, but I will tell you I was on a date with a young lady, and she said to me, you know, you'd be perfect for my sister. And her sister turns out to be my wife of 28 years, so it worked out. So that's, well, I appreciate the opportunity to join you today, and it's a pleasure to be amongst so many individuals committed to the preservation of religious minorities in the Middle East, the birthplace of Christianity. Over 2,000 years ago, St. Mark, a native of Libya, brought Christianity to Egypt. For as long as we can remember, Egypt's Coptic Christians have been treated like second-class citizens, despite the fact that they're indigenous to the nation. After the Muslim Brotherhood was removed from power in Egypt, mobs went on a rampage, targeting Christian institutions. Make no mistake about it, they were not spontaneous, haphazard attacks like some have claimed. They were coordinated and well-planned attacks, and you need look no further than the Muslim Brotherhood's official social media accounts to see who the culprits were. Ultimately, the Copts endured the worst violence they've seen since the 14th century. The Muslim Brotherhood's rhetoric was laced with sectarian verbiage and false statements meant to incite their followers. The Muslim Brotherhood's animosity for the Copts is a cornerstone of their founding and a guiding principle. Since that awful week in August, Egypt has elected President Sisi to serve as its president. I'm happy to see that he's taken a series of positive and, in some cases, unprecedented steps to ensure that the rights of the Copts are acknowledged and respected. In addition to becoming Egypt's first president to attend Christmas liturgy, which is he's now done twice, when he was defense minister, he was also promised that the Egyptian armed forces would restore the churches that were damaged by the mobs in August of 13. Despite promises by the military to restore all the churches, 3 years later, 26 of the 78 churches have been restored. An additional 23 have been restored by private citizens. I'm happy that progress has been made, but also look forward to a more ambitious effort to restore the churches. And that's why I'm proud to announce this week I'll be introducing the Coptic Churches Accountability Act. My bill would restore and require that the State Department provide an annual report to Congress regarding the efforts of our officials at the State Department in Cairo and survey and secure the restoration and repair of burned, damaged, and otherwise destroyed Christian properties in Egypt. My bill would also create a comprehensive list of all Christian-owned properties and items that were damaged so we have a better understanding of the extent of the violence and the damage that took place, some of which I'm sure will include timeless, irreplaceable items. I'd also like to take a minute to discuss the newly passed law by the Egyptian parliament. Egypt is undoubtedly one of the most important and closest friends we have in the world, and the support it has received from Congress certainly suggests that. However, friends also have to be honest with one another. I understand that church construction is a sensitive issue in Egypt, and while I'm elated that President Sisi has regularly stated that all Egyptians are equal and has at times taken unprecedented actions to promote that goal, it seems that the rhetoric on the national level has not reached local officials or even the parliament. I was happy to see the Egyptian parliament pass a new law regarding church construction, but I fear that this new law still suggests that the Copts are second-class citizens in Egypt. Laws send a message and play a significant role in shaping cultures. The new law passed by the Egyptian parliament unfortunately sends a message to society that Copts are still not equal, If if all Egyptians are not equal under the law, then the law should reflect that. And that means all religions must adhere to the same type of construction laws regarding their houses of worship. For centuries, the United States diplomatic leadership has contributed meaningfully and materially to the international protection of religious minorities and their faith-based practices and places of worship. As Michigan's only member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I plan to continue to condemn violations of religious freedom while also working to assist and encourage our allies in the promotion of fundamental right to freedom of religion. We simply have no other choice. Thank you, and I appreciate it's an honor to be with you today. And we have votes in a few minutes, so I may run, but again, it's an honor to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Trott, for your very inspiring work, and you can count on our support for the passage of the act. At this time, I'd like to pass the microphone over to our moderator for today's panel, Mr. Andrew Doran. Andrew is a senior advisor and co-founder of In Defense of Christians, alongside Tufik Baklini, In Defense of Christians president, who's here today. A prolific writer and a speaker on the plight of Christian communities in the Middle East, and more broadly on U.S. foreign policy, culture, and human rights, Mr. Doran is a former public servant within the Executive Secretariat of the U.S. National Commission for UNESCO and is an armed forces veteran. Mr. Doran co-founded IDC in 2013 alongside President Baklini and has remained IDC's senior policy advisor throughout its growth. Andrew?
Thank you. Thank you, Kirsten. Good afternoon. We're here today at the start of a 3-day convention calling for direct action on behalf of Christians and other minority communities across the Middle East that have been subjected to discrimination, persecution, and genocide. They've also been the victims of more abstract realities, realities with very real consequences: indifference, ignorance, misperceptions, realpolitik, and too often good but naive intentions. We are here to be a voice for the Christians and others in the Middle East, not in some sectarian sense, not simply because they are Christians. If we care only about the tribe, then we really can't be of service to the Christians of the Middle East at all. Muslims have also suffered terribly. Numerically, they've suffered worst of all. The terrible violence that plagues the Middle East cannot be combated either through containment or through America's isolation. This violence will only be worsened by regarding the other with fear and hatred, which serves the interests only of violent extremism. Nor can it ultimately be combated exclusively through military force, though such force will be necessary in the short term. Deeply complex forces brought us to where we are today. Accidents and currents of history, dehumanizing ideologies and pathologies, and powerful social, cultural, and economic forces. So what can we do about all these from Washington? Last year, we gathered to rally behind a resolution to recognize ISIS as genocide. One journalist asked, "Is anyone listening?" 6 months later, the U.S. House of Representatives and the Secretary of State had recognized genocide against Yazidis, Christians, and others. So the question is, what do we do now? We're proud to be joined by IDC's partners at this year's convention, the Philos Project, the Armenian National Committee of America, and the Institute for Global Engagement, partners with whom we share a vision for a more just and stable Middle East, with equality for minorities and more just societies for all. We're here to offer practical policy solutions to deeply complex problems. These are communities that have suffered and suffered horribly. And as we call upon others to act, we cannot be blind to our own contributions to tragedy in the Middle East through imprudence, indifference, and inaction. So we seek to engage those in the region who share the values of our people and the interests of our nation. Together, we will advocate for the Christian, Yazidi, and other communities in northern Iraq, that they may return to their homes on the Nineveh Plain, to be secured there by coalition and successive international forces. We will continue to work with offices on Capitol Hill for a resolution to support efforts in Iraq toward the recognition of a province for the indigenous peoples of the Nineveh Plain. This model will, we believe, not only restore the communities of that region, victims of profound violence, but also pave the way for a more decentralized, federated governance structure that will better serve all the people of Iraq. And we've been working with several offices, including Congressman Fortenberry's office, and I believe that this community can continue to count on his leadership. We will advocate for greater stability and security for Lebanon, a pluralistic nation where Christians, Shia, Sunni, Druze, and others live in fragile but persevering peace, despite threats from within and without. We expect very soon to be able to announce the introduction of a bipartisan resolution to this end. We will also ask leaders to work toward the rapid conclusion of the conflict in Syria, where those who most desperately long for peace are also the most vulnerable. Lebanon faces significant challenges: violent extremism, the refugee crisis, and attempts by regional powers to control Lebanon as a proxy. And America cannot be indifferent to these challenges. We will advocate for justice for the 1.5 million Armenians, Assyrians, and other Christians slaughtered and displaced in the last century's first genocide, whose descendants today still live in communities across the region, in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Syria, and Iran, many under daily threats from terrorists and tyrannical regimes. If this genocide had been acknowledged then, subsequent genocides might have been prevented. We should remember the Armenians, not only because they are a part of the region's communities to this day, but by the example they forged in the Middle East, surviving genocide, slaughter, and trauma, when few voices were raised on their behalf and none came to their defense. We are proud to support Congressman Robert Dole's resolution on the Armenian genocide, which has 51 Democrat and 18 Republican co-sponsors. We will advocate for the Christians of Egypt, the Coptic community of many millions who seek only equality before the law and beside their neighbor. And we're very proud to be able to support Congressman Trott's legislation, and we're very grateful to him for coming here today. And we will ask lawmakers to use all resources at their disposal to bring an end to the conflict in Syria, which is not only a humanitarian crisis, but a national security crisis. The violence in Syria, whether undertaken by state actors, quasi-state actors, or non-state actors, has resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths, millions of people displaced, and millions more traumatized. That conflict will breed a generation of violence that will make the terrorists of a generation ago in Afghanistan seem meek by comparison. All this on the shores of the Mediterranean. And it's not coming, it's here. It's in our churches, it's in our nightclubs, and it's in our public spaces. And it will get much worse before it gets better. If we move swiftly to end the conflict in Syria, we can save lives there now and save American lives and other lives elsewhere in the decades to come. Finally, we want to send a message to Muslims in both the West and the Middle East, in our words and in our deeds, that we are not adversaries, but brothers and sisters struggling against common enemies. Not only ISIS and other extremists, but also unjust governance, which has perpetrated acts of terrorism and crimes against humanity. That they are welcome here in America as we have felt welcome in their communities and homes in the Middle East. Though we may not share a common faith and culture, we do, at a minimum, share a common humanity. And we are acutely aware of the suffering of millions of Muslims, and we are not indifferent to that suffering. We are also aware of heroic Muslims such as Professor Mahmoud al-Asali of the University of Mosul, who in the summer of 2014 condemned ISIS's treatment of Mosul's Christians and paid the ultimate sacrifice. Indeed, it's our aim to promote policies that will serve all people in the Middle East, Muslim, Jew, Christian, Yazidi, people of all faith and none. We believe that what we propose is not just in the interests of the Christians and others in the Middle East, but in America's interests. This balancing of values and interests brings to mind the words of a great realist and Christian thinker of the last century, Reinhold Niebuhr, who wrote, "Nothing that is worth doing can be achieved in our lifetime. Therefore, we must be saved by hope. Nothing which is true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history. Therefore, we must be saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone. Therefore, we must be saved by love. No virtuous act is quite as virtuous from the standpoint of our friend or foe as it is from our standpoint. Therefore, we must be saved by the final form of love, which is forgiveness." Thank you. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce the executive director of the Philos Project, Robert Nicholson. The Philos Project promotes positive engagement in the Middle East through more intellectually rigorous foreign policy and the revival of Christian realism, by building relationships with those in the region who support liberty and just governance, particularly between Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities. The Philos Project also advances greater understanding of Israel and the Jewish people, and spreading the vision of a multi-ethnic and multi-religious Middle East based on freedom and the rule of law. Mr. Nicholson, a former Marine, is an advocate for Christians in the region, particularly for the Assyrian community of Mesopotamia. A soldier scholar, we're proud to have him here with us today to speak about the Assyrian and Christian communities of Iraq, their future, and please join me in welcoming Robert Nicholson.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. We gather here today to begin several days of education and advocacy dedicated to an endangered indigenous minority that is facing genocide in the Middle East. How can Middle Eastern Christians be protected? What is their future in the region? These are the questions we're here to ask with the belief that we can help. After much thought, research, trips to the region, we believe that part of the answer lies in the creation of a new province on the Nineveh Plain, a 1,600 square mile region of northern Iraq and the ancient Assyrian homeland that will be dedicated to the protection and empowerment of these Christians and other minorities as they return home after the Islamic State is rolled back. We, the organizers of this conference, are currently advocating for a new congressional resolution that voices U.S. support for the government of Iraq as it moves to create this province. But let me go back. There are two ways to think about the problem of Christians in the Middle East. The first is to start with the Christians and zoom out. The second is to start with the region and zoom down into the Christians. And I prefer the latter approach. What has been happening in the Middle East since 2011, and perhaps before, has been a war of all against all. Long repressed communities are coming out from under powerful governments, seeking to protect their own interests from the interests of others at all costs. Sectarianism, ethno-nationalism, and fear are the main features of this transitional period between dictatorship and whatever comes next. Weak minorities like the Assyrians and Yazidis in Iraq are caught in the crossfire and unable to defend themselves. Right now, Iraq and its problems seem very far away. We all feel the temptation to stay out of it and mind our own business. But like it or not, our American future is bound up in this region, at least for the foreseeable future. Minding our business is simply not an option. Even putting moral duty aside, our strategic interest demands that we formulate a real policy that is in tune with the religious and cultural realities on the ground. Experience shows us, especially in recent years, that problems of the Middle East never stay there, and solving problems upstream as best as we can is far better than dealing with them downstream. We need a vision, we need a long-term plan, and Christians must have a place in that plan. So what is it? Most policymakers today, both here and in Iraq, agree that part of the solution lies in decentralization. What is decentralization? Essentially, it means pushing power and governance down to the local level as much as possible, and it's a concept that we here in the U.S. fully embrace. In Iraq, that means creating new districts and provinces that allow the country's unique ethnic and religious communities to feel a sense of empowerment, participation, and territorial security in the post-Islamic State future. Iraq has been working to decentralize more and more. For example, in January 2014, a few months before ISIS invaded, the Iraqi cabinet decided to create 3 new provinces, one of them being the Nineveh Plain province. Once the Islamic State is pushed out, that decentralization process will and should continue. In the words of Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi, if we don't decentralize, the country will disintegrate. To me, there are no limitations to decentralization. But this process should continue in the proper sequence. And the first community that needs to be helped and empowered are the Assyrian Christians and other minorities on the Nineveh Plain. As victims of genocide, they deserve priority. We believe that they need safe passage to return to their homeland once ISIS is pushed back. They need administrative autonomy in their local affairs. They need to be trained and equipped to field their local police and security forces just like other parts of the Iraqi population. They should be protected by an international rapid deployment force based in the Nineveh Plain with the agreement of the government of Iraq. They deserve first priority for economic aid and development. They need legal protections for their language and their culture. And they need to, lastly, be brought into political participation in a much more intentional and greater way. You see, there's a structural problem at play here. Everyone wants to help the Christians with aid. But until now, there has been no structure through which to deliver it. There's no address to mail the check. In 2010, Congress appropriated $10 million to aid these Christians, but the money somehow disappeared in the pockets of various intermediaries along the way. The Assyrian, Chaldean, Syriac Christians need a territorial base, a protected space, where they can get the direct help they need to rebuild their lives and their culture. Christians in the Middle East will only be safe when they have a protected homeland, at least in Iraq, a foundation on which to build their shattered society. And history has shown us various examples of this concept working in practice, of minority peoples under existential threat, surviving and sometimes even thriving by securing territory. The State of Israel, the country of Armenia, Iraqi Kurdistan, even, to a far less satisfactory degree, Native American Indian reservations here in the United States. Without a homeland or a physical space to call their own, the fate of these people today, these nations, would be far different. The government of Iraq has endorsed the Nineveh Plain province idea. The Kurdistan regional government has endorsed the idea. The European Parliament has recognized the importance of securing the Nineveh Plain for Assyrians, Chaldeans, and others, and the time has come for the U.S. to do the same. There is much that needs to be done in support of Middle Eastern Christians in Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, and other parts of the region. However, the Nineveh Plain is the natural place to start, as both the cradle of the Christian faith and the locus of the current genocidal conflict. It would be strange if we started anywhere else. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. It's now my pleasure to introduce Aram Hamparian. He's Executive Director of the Armenian National Committee of America, serving as ANCA's representative to the White House, Congress, and the Washington, D.C. foreign policy community. Mr. Hamparian is a native of New Jersey, growing up as an active member of the Armenian Youth Federation and later the Armenian National Committee of New Jersey. A graduate of the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, in political science, he began working with ANCA in 1990, where he has advocated for justice for the victims of the Armenian genocide and their descendants, whose very survival offers hope to all victims of genocide, crimes against humanity, and terrorism. Please join me in welcoming Aram Hamparian.
Thank you all very much. We are here today asking for nothing more than an American policy on Christians in the Middle East. A strategy consistent with our American values, first and foremost, religious freedom. An approach aligned with core U.S. interests, regional stability, open societies, and policies responsive to us as American citizens, all of us and others who are a part of this movement. Sadly, in place of an actual American policy, our own leaders, successive U.S. administrations, Democrat and Republican, have instead pursued policies that have very often been imposed by foreign interests. U.S. leaders have allowed vetoes exercised by corrupt dictators, even enforced gag rules silencing our moral voice as Americans. The examples that speak to us as Armenian Americans are, of course, U.S. complicity in Turkey's obstruction of justice for the Armenian genocide, the effective U.S. green light on Turkey's destabilizing offensives into Syria, and even U.S. support for a peace plan that would force the Christians of Nagorno-Karabakh under a foreign Azerbaijani dictatorship. These irresponsible policies are all too often enforced by U.S. officials based on narrow, short-sighted political considerations, based on fear, not hope, appeasement, not engagement. Reckless policies based on the false hope that just one more concession to the forces of intolerance will somehow turn the corner, will somehow lead to a better future. It's a lie. It always has been. Let's be very clear. Tossing Christians under the bus is not a strategy. Betraying religious minorities is not an American value. And abandoning an entire region of the world to the forces of intolerance is not a U.S. interest. There is a better way, and it begins with rejecting the false choice between our values and our interests. That is why we are here. That is why we support In Defense of Christians. That is why we are so pleased to join with all of our coalition partners in charting a more sound, a more sustainable future for the Christians and all the minorities of the Middle East. We can, of course, be very proud of the great work of IDC. Progress made against influential interests and the institutional inertia of essentially a century of American inaction. We've seen the passage of H-Con-Res 75 and S-Res 340, recognizing the ISIS genocide against Christians and others. Special thanks to Reps. Fortenberry and Eshoo, Senators Cassidy, Kirk, and so many others. We've seen IDC's groundbreaking report written with the assistance of the Knights of Columbus that documented that genocide and led this administration to finally identify it as such. And something that you don't see every day, but something that's taking place every single day, is the sustained effort, the targeted, unprecedented advocacy by IDC, shining the spotlight of public scrutiny on elected officials, on diplomats, on bureaucrats who would betray the rights of Assyrians, Chaldeans, Syriacs, Yezdis, Kurds, Armenians, Copts, and others for short-term political gain, for short-term political expediency. This progress, this very real progress, has been the result of vision, the result of hard work, and a laser-like focus on smart solutions, but also because IDC's mission is fundamentally an American mission. The principles that inform and inspire IDC truly represent our highest aspirations as a nation and our best hope for the future. And so it's in this spirit that Americans of Armenian heritage, joined with all of you, our brothers and sisters in Christ, and all of our friends, we're bound together by a shared history and a common future, and united in supporting the advocacy agenda of ITC. As has been noted, establishing a province for indigenous Christians in Iraq, in the Nineveh Plain region, very important. We put our shoulder to the wheel behind that aim. It's very worthwhile. Generating U.S. support for security and stability in Lebanon and relief for Syrian refugees, including those who have found their way to Armenia and other parts of the world. Encouraging reforms of the legal regulations regarding the rebuilding and construction of churches in Egypt. We stand shoulder to shoulder with our Coptic brothers and sisters. And finally, it means a lot to us as Armenians, as refugees of an earlier age who found refuge in Muslim homes and were saved in great measure by the charity of the Christian world. We welcome the support of IDC and all of our partners for a truthful and just, for U.S. support for a truthful and just resolution of the Armenian genocide, the genocide committed, the SEFO, the Tsegaspanatun in Armenian we say, the genocide committed against Assyrians and Armenians, Pontian Greeks, other Greeks, all the Christians of that region. All of these issues, the agenda and the broader set of challenges that face our community, they are all tied closely to one another. Progress on one reinforces progress on all. Justice for one represents a step toward justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Aram. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Alexis Mukarzel, an academic, architect, and IDC board member. Professor Mukarzel served as Dean of Faculty of Fine Arts at the University of the Holy Spirit in Kazlik, Lebanon. Though an expert on church, art, and architecture, He has spent countless hours since 2014 overseeing humanitarian relief to Assyrian and Chaldean refugees currently living in Lebanon, just outside Beirut. These refugees are from the Nineveh Plain and from the Kabur region of Hazaka province in Syria, two communities that have suffered terribly at the hands of ISIS. Please join me in welcoming Professor Alexei Mukarzel. Thank you.
Sustainable cultural framework for an autonomous zone in the Nineveh Plain. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, after the destruction of the churches and monasteries of northern Mesopotamia, after the historic manuscripts were burned and lost, and Hatra, Nimrud, Nineveh, and Ashur, among the finest archaeological jewels, were wiped out. The last act of genocide aimed at erasing the memory of the oldest apostolic Christian communities of northern Iraq and eastern Syria, and the community of the Yazidis and other minorities. What a loss. The other form of genocide is cultural genocide. Being physical or moral, it wipes out the identity of a nation. In the Middle East, the communities have their raison d'etre through their respective traditions that define their past and present and shape their future through an identitarian perspective. The question of identity is very important while dealing with the question of minorities. Their historic resilience was supported by a tripod formed by culture, identity, and community. As such, the cohesion of the Eastern churches in northern Mesopotamia was consolidated amid the tribulations of the centuries, where they endured pressures and sometimes persecutions. They assess that the other form of resistance is cultural resistance. From their background of Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilizations, from Sumer, Babylon, and Nineveh, the Syriac, Chaldean, and Assyrian churches had a past of glory that was overshadowed by a partially obscured history. Tolerated and active during the Abbasid period, they fueled knowledge in medicine, science, and revived back the highlights of the Greco-Roman antiquity. They expanded their churches through the Silk Roads up to China, founding more than 200 eparchies in Asia, from where they radiated their culture, acting as an interface between the civilizations of the East and West. Some of its traces perdured. The Mongol script, for example, was one of them. Beyond genocide, we foresee to restore the shattered communities of Christians, Yazidis, and other minorities of the historic northern Mesopotamia, in Iraq and Syria, where they have been molested in their body and values, and give them the hope in their future, a radiant future that is seen as an advent yet to come, but defined mainly by identitarian aspects, specific to their traditions and rooted in history. History, as a sociocultural experience, is the clue of identity, whose profile is drawn by the integral of the facts of being, of suffering, and from exaltation. A sum of experiences that shaped their personalities throughout centuries. The preservation or reinstallment of these persecuted communities in their homeland, the Nineveh Plain, securing their rights through a political form of autodetermination, supposes the establishment of a safe haven under an international umbrella with the consentment of their neighbors and coreligionists in a global Mesopotamian Iraqi framework. International support, both material and immaterial, should flow, triggering prosperity that will develop and everlast. If fueled by a self-sufficient economy and consolidated by people's strong sense of belonging there, to their land, to their traditions, in an effort to extrapolate the curve of history towards radiating culture and playing an active role in the neighboring areas and beyond. This input can preserve these communities, notably the Apostolic Christian churches of the East, from losing the essence of their identity, their communitarian organic active links, and the purpose of their existence. But also, beyond aesthetics and aspects of social cohesion, culture can assume the role of boosting the economy. And this is my point. Culture is not a margin. Culture is in the core of everything, and culture is a base to boost the economy. Addressing your respectful audience in a country where dreams come true, I invite you to share this dream, hoping that it could come true, and that a safe haven for Christians, Yazidis, and other minorities in the Nineveh plain could be prosperous and radiate culture again by the implementation of a framework founded on education, production, and networking. It will comprise. No, not yet. We have the plan of the framework now. The promotion of a high-level educational school system that can serve as a focal point to the neighboring regions. The assessment of a technical formation system through centers specialized in the many fields of IT, media, press, artisanal craft, hotel, and restaurant, but mainly and above all in agriculture and its related industry, to consolidate the link between man and the land and make this agricultural area live again. The establishment of a small university connected with one or more universities in the United States, professing the needed formations at the highest level for the whole northern Mesopotamia. This university will also help to reinstall Christian and other scholars back in their homeland that will become a shining center of knowledge for the region. To build with international funds and under UNESCO umbrella, a museum for the recovered archaeological pieces and the new pieces yet to be discovered in the archaeological sites. To build and sustain with international funds a center of research in history, archaeology, and humanities affiliated to UNESCO. To give the major international universities interested in archaeology, and I'm sure in the US only there are dozens of them, give them this opportunity of digging there. It will make a great change. To give the major international universities interested in archaeology facilities to conduct explorations on archaeological sites and to train local personnel. Residence for international scholars and archaeologists will follow. The promotion of a fine art center with international connectivity for training and production in the fields of painting, sculpture, theater, music, and more, in order to revive the patrimony of Mesopotamia. Let people live again their patrimony and make it modern and make it dynamic and project it to modernity, and by organizing exhibitions and festivals that will draw thousands from abroad. The foundation of an official media center and TV, press, to act as a connective link to the world, and finally, to promote social cohesion around the local churches by assuring funds to build community gathering halls and teaching rooms affiliated to the churches. Such a full program will create an interactive climate encouraging the educators, artists, and scholars to have permanent or temporary stays in the plain of Nineveh. We want people, learned people, to go back there and have these links, and these will make the difference, believe me. If you leave this northern Mesopotamian area protected, whatever you want, dry, it will not survive. Let it live by culture, and it will be dynamic, and itself it will create links. So artists and scholars will have permanent and temporary stays in the plain of Nineveh. This move will be activated by creating a scholarship fund to promote academic and professional implications and international events. As a result, and in the mainstream of a revived cultural life, we set structural links, merging culture in the economy, the merger of culture and economy, in order to generate a sustainable wealth for future prosperity without depending on international funding on the long term. Such a program will support the economy and make the Nineveh region assume its historic glory and shine knowledge in the region, serving again as an interface between Mesopotamia and the world, and assessing for consideration and respect that will preserve the Nineveh Autonomous Region from neglect and from the dangers of future depredations. With all my regards.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the panel portion. And so at this time, I would like to open up the panel to any questions from the media. Sir?
Take two. Yeah. John Gizzi with Newsmax, online and television. First, listening to Dr. Sweat reminded me as a very young reporter reporting on her father, who had many accomplishments, becoming one of only 3 Republicans to win a Democratic seat in the 1980 elections. And
Except it was the other way around. He was one of
Democrat
only 2
winning a
Democrats
Republican
in
seat, I should say. So that
Basically, you've got the story, though.
right, one of 3. Anyway, my question really is related to something that Dr. Sweat said. You talk about the new province and 1,600 square miles for an area for those driven from their homelands and persecuted, and also about the devolution of authority to the regions. It would seem you have a natural ally right in Dr. Sweat's old boss, Vice President Biden. When he was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, he wanted a federation. He once corrected me saying, when I said partitioning, that's not what he wanted. He wanted a federation with more local control for Shiites, Sunni, and Kurds. And my question is, has the Vice President weighed in on this, or has anyone from IDC spoken to him about helping in this good cause? Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I appreciate the question. We have been in contact with the Vice President's office just in the last couple of weeks. He's been very busy of late. I think he would be probably disinclined to deviate from official U.S. policy. And so I can't even imagine, I'm certainly not going to speak for him. But let's talk about then Senator Biden's 2006 op-ed in the New York Times with Leslie Gelb of the Council on Foreign Relations. I've heard so many critics of the Vice President, generally from the political right, over the last 10 years who have slowly come around to the conclusion that a decentralized, federated Iraq that focused on local governance and empowered local governance would have prevented the very crisis that we have in front of us today. And so, and I don't want to speak for Robert, and I'll certainly let him answer this question. And I guess I would just say that while I don't believe that he addressed the question of minorities specifically, he was looking for, sort of looking toward the larger issue of Iraq. I think that's a model that we would say is consistent. I think it's I think that it is served in limited capacity. That the federated model in Iraq has worked very well, and that would be the KRG, whose independence has allowed them, despite a number of challenges, to thrive post 1991. So I think. The model that he was using was Bosnia. It was the Dayton Peace Accords of '95 implemented in '96, and that's what he was referencing. That's what he and Leslie Gelb were referring to as a model for decentralizing and federating Iraq, and I think that certainly would have been preferable. It's difficult to imagine a worse outcome than the one we face right now. So I think it's safe to say we'd be supportive. Robert, I don't know if you have anything you wish to add.
No, I think that's a great explanation. I think the only thing that's really sort of missing from the plan as it was presented in 2006, and again, it's unclear whether he would support this idea, is that often when people talk about the devolution of power, they name those three groups, the Sunni Arabs, the Shiite Arabs, and the Kurds. And the reality is there's other people in Iraq. So I think my main gripe with the plan is that it leaves out, hundreds of thousands and really over 1 million Iraqis, and making room for them in whatever the post-ISIS plan is really, for us, a top priority.
Aram, please.
Okay. Well, for an Armenian perspective, Armenians have been in this part of the world for 4,000 plus years. We've been a kingdom, we've been a colony, and just about everything in between. And I can say, having lived through this independence era of Armenia, that the Assyrian nation, the Chaldean Syriacs, the Assyrian nation requires a homeland, a place that can be protected and built and nurtured. That is, just my read on the situation is, there's no. The formula of community, I get that, right? Armenians have lived as communities in a dozen or more Middle Eastern countries. It's important, and we should be good citizens of those countries and contribute however we can, but the sustainable model is some measure of self-determination, ideally independence.
Dr. Lantos.
I would just add that I think what is very important about this plan that each of the panelists has addressed today is that this puts on the table a positive, proactive vision that I actually think politicians could mobilize around. It, I think, matches the zeitgeist, if you will, of where we are now politically in the United States. The vast majority, I think, of the American people understand that our current policy has been inadequate, to put it very, very diplomatically, and has resulted in, tragic outcomes. But there is wariness, and there is little appetite for somehow simply jumping in without a vision. I think you were the one who spoke about the need for a vision. And I took notes as Professor Mukherjee was laying out that vision. And again, I think when we think about the political reality that there are 435 members in Congress, there are 100 senators, and they all have constituencies that they need to sort of be aware of and be mindful of. This sort of a vision that, yes, it involves some degree of international commitment in terms of protection, and certainly it involves a significant degree of international commitment in terms of investment, and that has to be led by the United States. Let's just put on our big boy and big girl panties and recognize that if the United States doesn't lead, nothing will happen. But this vision is real, it's concrete, it is sustainable, it is hopeful, and I think that that's a very critical component about what this initiative is that you're working on, that it resonates because it makes sense.
Thank you, Dr. Lantos. Any questions from the, please, sir?
Yeah, hi. My name is Alfred Baroud. I'm from Yalla.Today. It's a daily news. First of all, excuse my English. It's my third language. as I understood, you are tailor-made situations or solutions according to each Christians in the Arab countries. Example, the Copts. You want to interfere with the legal system in Egypt to evolve it to protect their rights. In Iraq, you want to protect them with a military presence or in a protectorate. And in Lebanon, you want to keep this balance. So, if you succeed, it's good, but it is tailor-made, it's not a general solution. If it doesn't work with the local or for each country, the government, which is, excuse me, okay. If it doesn't work because each country has its own government and its own authority, so you will be interfering with each country a legal system and authority. How are you going to implement this? Or I can understand it could be a try to save them and you can't save them, so you will bring them here? Or create a country for the Christians like you are supporting Israel, you will support a Christian country. Thank you.
Thank you, Alfred. I'll sort of work my way back, and I'll invite the panelists to respond. The first thing I would say is that no one's calling for the creation. No one's calling for the creation of a country. What we're talking about is in January 2014. In January 2014, the Iraqi Council of Ministers set forward an initiative to create 3 new provinces. One of those was the Nineveh Plain for the minority communities of the Nineveh Plain, not all of which are Christian. And of course, ISIS came later in 2014. But to make a long story short, this is an initiative of the Iraqi people for the Iraqi people. And what we are saying is we are lending our support to the cause of Iraqis, particularly minority community Iraqis, who wish to have their province be a better representation of ethnic and religious realities on the ground, rather than an 18,000 square kilometer Nineveh province that is so ethnically and religiously diverse and unfortunately sectarian in nature that it cannot be held it cannot credibly claim to represent the interests of all those present. In that sense, you might say that it is a microcosm of Iraq itself, and so further decentralization would be in the interests of all the people of that region. On the question of Egypt, I believe you used the term to interfere with Egypt, and perhaps it was precisely chosen, perhaps not. But I would say that the American people give billions of dollars every year to the Egyptian government, and I think it's very little to ask that commitments to religious freedom and to equality for all people of Egypt is not an unreasonable request. And so, and with respect to a military presence, when something as egregious as genocide and crimes against humanity have taken place, the purpose of the United States and the so-called international community, of the United Nations and the international community, is to exist to protect innocent, defenseless people from crimes against humanity, genocide, terrorism, and other forms of violence. And so would this need to be led by the United States? Absolutely, but I believe there are 17 countries in the coalition against ISIL, and I believe there are a number of countries who could be persuaded to commit observers and international peace enforcers and peacekeepers to a project of revitalization, rebuilding, and returning IDPs and refugees to their home. My hope is that Armenia could be one of those countries to lend a hand there. So, so Alfred, I hope I answered your question, and I don't know if anybody else would care to respond. Okay, thank you. Sir, please.
So, Alan Dargham from MTV Lebanon, from Lebanon. It's a
Hello,
outlet
Alan.
TV station. So basically the feeling in the Middle East, like they don't trust the administration here, the latest administration, even before, because all the policies were applied very, not very accurate and not not typically or given any results. Like even in Lebanese Civil War 1975, instead of the U.S. take a side with the Christians, they supported the stronger because they have bigger agenda if a group of Christians want to survive or not. Now we're coming to a new election. We have two candidates, Trump and Clinton. We're looking forward. First, I think IDC has to build a new trust relationship with the people in the Middle East because they have especially the Christians, because they felt they were left over for a long time ago, and we can witness this in Iraq, going through to Lebanon, Egypt, and other places that minority live in the Middle East. So, as IDC, which direction will take? Are we talking here about candidate, about political party, or a person? Or Hillary Clinton? She had a good experience. At the same time, she was in place in power, but maybe she didn't deliver much. Or Donald Trump has no experience. How do we look forward about these two candidates to look for a better future for the Christians in the Middle East?
Thank you very much for that question. Does anybody want to lead off? I'm going to punt on that one.
Well, I'm willing to take a crack at it. You know, I guess obviously this has been an unusual presidential election in our country, unlike any I've experienced in my lifetime. And, you know, from all sides, one hears these doomsday predictions, depending on what place in the political spectrum people come from. In terms of sort of the domestic challenge that we'll face, whoever prevails in the election, I would say that my own conviction is that America's underlying democratic institutions and long democratic history are much stronger, much more enduring, and much more resilient than the slings and arrows of whatever outrageous fortune may befall us politically in the near term. And so, you know, while I have a point of view about this this presidential campaign, I am less alarmed than many at the likelihood of America to sort of endure as a strong and vibrant, and I hope central democratic force in the world, regardless of the outcome of the presidential election. But what I would say is that whoever prevails, we do need a new policy in the Middle East. I think we can all acknowledge that the recent policy has not been a success by any criteria, And we know that there is a reluctance, I think, on the part of the American people to pay the price of leadership, to pay the price of engagement, to pay the price of living up to our moral convictions and standards. But I think history shows us that that the price we pay for failing to live up to our obligations of leadership is ultimately much greater and much higher. And so, you know, without responding specifically as to how a President Hillary Clinton or a President Donald Trump will act, because I'm really not in a position to answer that question, I do think that it is in the early months of a new administration that the opportunity is greatest for impassioned, interested parties to weigh in, to try and help set the agenda, and to try and help push certain issues higher up on the priority list. And that's where I think IDC and other like-minded groups really have a job to do, but have a potentially very valuable role to play. Because, you know, nobody thinks what we're doing now is working. Nobody thinks what we're doing now is adequate, and nobody sees what some of my colleagues have referred to, which is a vision for how we help this most central cradle of civilization region of the world to chart a better course going forward. So the time to act will be in the early months of the new administration, whichever president will be sworn in.
I would agree 100%. There are elected officials like Congressman Lantos who have a very strong moral compass. They don't all have a strong moral compass. And very often they'll be responsive to what we do, what groups like us do. And I think I typically just worry less about this politician or that politician or this election or that election. We're more about, what are we doing about it? And to the extent that groups like us and others like us join forces and work, I think we'll see progress on these issues. I spoke a couple of weeks ago at a Armenian church retreat out in Chester County, Pennsylvania, and it's a wonderful Catholic facility there. And on the way back, I stopped actually to buy some blueberries at a store. It turned out to be an Amish store, and I got my blueberries and I got in my car, and then I looked in the bag, and they had put an invitation to a fundraiser that they had organized for Christians in Iraq. And I thought, wow, this is not just the Beltway. It's not just people like us getting together on days like this, but this is one of those classic cases where if there was a referendum, right, almost everything that we've asked for would be put in place, right? But it's not a referendum. It's a democracy. It's a republic, and we've got to work the system. But I guarantee you, most Americans, if asked this question, should we be doing more for Christians in the Middle East, you're going to get like an 80% response rate, 90% response rate. In Congress, it's a bit less. It just means that we've got to work hard.
Thank you, Aram. Sir.
I have a question for.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. I have a question for LBCI Lebanon, and I'm going to translate it because it was sent in Arabic.
Okay.
You believe that this convention has a goal to really help and support Christians stay in their land in the Middle East, but the West is accused to accelerate turbulence and help facilitate their leaving and coming and going to the West. And the truth is, the numbers of refugees are scary, specifically from Iraq, Syria, and Egypt, or even Lebanon. What are the actual strategies and tactics you are going to take to help to really keep them in their countries?
I think there are a couple of parts to that question. The first, if I understood the translation correctly, seems to assume that perhaps there's some, and I think any American or Westerner who's traveled to the Middle East encounters some interesting theories along the way, about, and I think, yeah, and these theories tend to assign a much greater skill for the nefarious than I think sometimes we actually possess. A lot of the unfortunate things that happen around the world, people tend to see America, I think, behind many things, or if you see something that's tragic, they think, well, America designed it that way, they must want it to be that way, and that's unfortunately not the case. It's just a series of unfortunate and linked events. I don't think there is. I don't think we've seen this. This starts with Syria. It starts and ends with the problems in Syria and bringing peace to Syria, and I think that the probably insufficient means have been utilized by our government to try and bring that conflict to an end, and to bring other powers around the world to bring that conflict to an end and begin returning, helping refugees to return to their home and to resettle. So I think that our policy agenda, as we've laid it out, very much touches on that issue, and I spoke in my remarks earlier about the need for the United States to try to end the conflict in Syria. But I'm not sure if that answers the question or not, but Robert or Ram? No? Okay. Sir?
1914, if people do not know about it, we had the greatest genocide in the history of humanity. 1/3 of the population of Mount Lebanon, which was Lebanon in this era, was starved to death. We're talking about 250,000 people. The starvation was led by the Ottoman Empire. During this era also, they slaughtered a great part of what we call northern part of Armenia. They call it southern Turkey now, and a great portion of the Syriac people. It's called Saifu. And this didn't end with the Turkey. They invaded Cyprus, and they provided lots of negative input to the rebuilding of churches in Turkey. we witnessed the last 2 weeks lots of support and sympathy from the current establishment to arrogant Erdogan. Can I ask what kind of leadership we are talking about, where we can support Christian in part of the Middle East, while in other parts this support can be changed? As I recall it, because I'm a university professor from Beirut, there is a theory called SLT, situational leadership theory, where leadership changes between case by case.
Yeah, it's certainly not a good projection of our values. Aram, would you want to take the first stab at that?
Forgive me for being a little cynical.
Please.
Okay. I would say, I'm going to take a little bit of a different cut on the question from a little bit different angle. Very often, for the people who manage our foreign policy, who plan and implement our relations with the international community, appeasement is the easy answer, right? They probably should be thinking about the next generation and the future and the international order and all that, but in reality, they're people and they're humans and they have the failings and ambitions of humans, and one of those is to worry, I'll say it this way, to worry more about perhaps their next promotion than the next generation, right? And if that's the case, they would think in terms of like, what's sort of how can I manage the situation? Should I take the risk of going to my bosses and talking about why the future of the Assyrians may disappear from this planet? Right? We may in our lifetime see the end of a 5,000-year-old culture, right? Who at the State Department, and I have a lot of friends at the State Department, who's going to go and knock on doors and talk to Secretary Kerry and the Deputy Secretary Blinken and all the others and say, we got to do something about this, right? At the risk of being seen as unrealistic or idealistic, right? And seeing their career kind of put on a slow track, right? So the easy answer very often is just to appease. If Turkey says they're going to throw a fit if you talk about the Armenian genocide, well, better we don't talk about it. And in the end, you end up compromising and compromising and compromising, and pretty soon you find yourself in a situation where you think you're advancing your interests, but really you're compromising your interests. Why? Because our moral standing is perhaps our greatest asset around the world. It's not going to be the economy going forward. The Chinese and the Indians and the Europeans are all going to have vast economic wealth. It's not going to be our military. We're not going to be sort of the non-peer competitor forever, right? So we're not going to be able to rely upon our military or economy just to dictate our will across the globe. It's going to come back to our enduring strength, which is our moral standing. People looking to us as a good example. And when we compromise that, I think we really sell ourselves short. But this is what we've done time and time again. The Armenians, have our shoulder to the wheel of this effort of how can we, make America a country, for example, that doesn't get bullied on issues of genocide, right? That would be a great thing. How can we be a country that stands up for Christians in the Middle East, even when it's inconvenient, even when the result for 1 week or 1 month or 1 year might be challenging, but the long-term benefit is enduring and beneficial. So it's the tough environment in which we work. It's a lot of the hardwiring of the system is wired against us, but this is our task and this is what we do.
Thank you, Aram. Sure, let's try it again.
Thank you. My name is Haik Napeti and I'm with the Television of Armenia. First question is about the cultural heritage. Professor touched upon this topic, particularly related to Christian heritage in Nineveh. How about preservation, restoration of Christian monuments and churches in Syria, in Iraq, and maybe also in Near East, not just Middle East, because we know that one of the residences of Armenian Supreme Patriarch was in Turkey. Now it's town of Kozan, and Armenian church is trying to restore its physically the building and maybe its possessions related to this building. And I was to this residence, and I was wondering if IDC has any perspective regarding physical restorations of these Armenian monuments and maybe restoring the possession, returning to the Armenian church. And the second question is, Armenia receives many refugees from Middle East. The number is around 20,000 at this stage, primarily Armenians, but also Assyrians. And although the figure itself may be small compared to refugees that go to Turkey, Jordan, and other places, but given the ratio of GDP of Armenia and the population of Armenia, I think Armenia now is in top 5 countries of recipients of refugees from Middle East. However, there's no much international support, financial support going to Armenia, and I was wondering if IDC has any perspective regarding this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With respect to the first question, Professor Mukarzel, I don't know if you'd care to address the question of architecture. and
Yes,
art.
now in restoring a monument, you can draw again the form, but you have to bring it to life again. In order to bring it to life, you have to establish the link between the community and the monument, or else the monument will be something apart. That's the first issue. Second, you have to clearly draw a conscience about the deep values of culture, the deep values and the constants of culture that could be still active today. And then your patrimony could become a living patrimony, and then it's possible that it will evolve. If it evolves, it goes through centuries. If it doesn't evolve, it will remain a piece of museum, and not far beyond. It will be dead and neglected. So this cultural conscious is fundamental. If IDC has a plan, we have the vision for that. We have the will to act as much as possible. And then I think that Mr. Doran will continue on that issue.
Thank you. Before you commit us to a UNESCO wing of IDC, we are an organization that, as you can imagine, because of the nature of our work, are pulled in a number of different directions and have to focus limited resources on a few narrow priorities. And so I would hope one day that this would be something that we could eventually branch into. And with respect to your question about the pressure of all the countries of the Middle East with respect to the refugee crisis, I don't know what the response can be other than bringing existing conflicts to a conclusion and beginning the question of reconciliation. If it's a question of, certainly the economic burden that has been placed on economies such as the economy of Lebanon, the economy of Jordan, even the economy of Turkey, which is a much larger country, but a smaller country like Armenia. Certainly that's significant, and I don't know that there's anything like sufficient resources in the international community to help support those challenges. Hope I answered your question. Thank you. We had a question over here, sir. Yes.
Yeah, Robert Miller with a small foundation. I've been watching the Middle East about 40 years now. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me now? Our policy in Iraq, our policy in Syria, as all of you have admitted now, has been kind of confused, to say it kindly, for about the last 20 or 30 years. I was really struck by the current issue of Time magazine. Of those of you who have not read it, there's a 4-page article in there on Mr. Putin and how he has become a very strong advocate for the growth of the Russian Orthodox faith inside Russia. And he is also now going to defend the Christian communities of Syria. I found that to be an incredibly interesting statement, because I would ask some of my people here and my elected leaders in Washington, why not let him do it? If that's, we would support that if he's going to bring it about. I think you'll immediately run into a buzzsaw of resistance. However, if that's, he wants to do that. It's just an observation.
Thank you. Does anybody care to comment or any?
I mean, I'll say, look, I'm not going to. I don't even know what to say to that. I've been hearing that for some time, and it's hard not to see a certain level of cynicism built into, Putin's, sudden desire to protect, Christian communities, or, in places that happen to be strategically useful to him. I think that I haven't seen it. I think that no one is protecting the Christians, particularly in Syria. They're completely left out of these negotiations about what post-Assad Syria, post-Civil War Syria looks like. I think a lot of it is lip service, and to the extent that it is, I think that there are far too many factors mitigating, letting Russia just sort of take over in Syria for Christians that need to be considered. I think it's very problematic, and I don't think we should trust them. I don't think there's any track record on which we should.
I will just add one other thing on the issue of Putin, and this is more about Russia from my perspective when I served on USCIRF, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. But we definitely saw troubling signs that to some degree the Russian Orthodox Church, particularly the Moscow Patriarchate, was becoming a bit of a, I won't say wholly owned subsidiary of the Kremlin, but there was this sense of not so much robust protection of religious freedom as favoritism for a chosen political ally. And so I too share a sense of skepticism. It may well be true that for his own strategic reasons, some of the things that Putin wants to do may have ancillary benefits, but count me skeptical as well in terms of his motivations.
Thank you, Doctor. Sir.
My name is David Fischler, and I'm not press, I'm not academic, I'm not political. I'm a pastor in Northern Virginia, Presbyterian. And so I look at this, at least in part, from the standpoint of the local church in America. And I think it's scandalous that the church in America, for the most part, has been seemingly asleep as all of this has happened over the last 5 years. So the question that I have for you and for the panel is, what do you need from, what would you like to see happen among local churches and Christian communities throughout the United States that would further the aims that you've laid out here today?
Thank you, Pastor. I think that's an excellent question. I think the first thing is to, one thing I like to encourage, if anybody has the means or they're able, is to simply go to the Middle East. Take a trip, take a small group, take a church group, and do go to the Middle East. Because I think we have these perceptions of, certainly there are regions beset by violence and that are very dangerous, but that's not the entire Middle East. There's a wonderful culture of hospitality across the many different cultures, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Yazidi. There's a great welcoming and warmth that you feel in this part of the world. And of course there are very real dangers as well, but that's the first thing. In other words, so I guess another way of saying that is to engage. The second thing I would say is that there are any number of creative things that you would do normally, things that you would do with any suffering group of people in your own community. Those same things can be done. We encourage people to adopt parishes. Some pastors have attempted, they would like to take Syrian refugee families, and not Christian but Muslim. And Pope Francis is someone who called for this in Europe. Now, how practicable is this, especially in the United States? I don't know. So, but I think that there are, and I'd be happy to follow up offline with you, because we get this as a question we get fairly frequently, and I think that there is a lot that may be done to help a lot of the people suffering in the Middle East. I don't know if anybody else, Alexi has done amazing work helping Assyrian and Chaldean refugees in the Beirut area who were relocated. How many are there?
It depends on the communities. Maybe 5,000-10,000.
Yeah.
But the problem is that these refugees come to Lebanon just to get a passport and then go abroad. And this problem we want to manage, in a sense that we give them security again, because they are frightened by so much pressures in history, and they can't be left alone. And then they need the economical links to get them back in a network so they can be stabilized. That's what we need. If they stay in Lebanon temporarily to go back to their regions in Syria or Iraq, that's good. But the problem is that they want to leave. They don't want to hear again about this Middle East, which could be a trap. They don't want the trap anymore. And that's why in the cultural program we proposed, it's a sort of giving an international active, yes, and active vitalizing force from inside. When you bring scholars and so on, you install them, and all these thousands of people moving around, all the cultural knots, and so you can give these people a purpose to be there again under an international umbrella. It's very important that this umbrella will not be protected, activated by one party, because if this is a party today, it might be the failing party tomorrow. It should be a consensus between everybody and the people of the region also. Because these people, and that's what they did during centuries, they waited for, I'm talking about the Kurds and Shabaks and other, they waited for a weakness in the powers of the region to jump over the Christians and rob them or push them beyond their villages. So we need that consensus first.
Pastor Fischler, I'm also going to invite Robert and Aram to answer that question, and Dr. Lantos-Sweat if she likes.
Yeah, thank you, David. That's a terrific question. And it's actually one that I've been asked frequently, so I have something of an answer to it. The two sort of answers for me are, besides going to the region, which I think is a terrific suggestion, the first one is sort of common sense. Give. There's so much need, so much economic aid that's needed for people's just basic human needs. And also advocating. Churches are churches, and churches do what churches do, but churches are communities of people who live in different parts of this country. And I think that, for example, on some of the resolutions and different measures we're proposing, it would be fantastic if church, communities of Christians around this country were mobilized. But there's sort of a threshold question, I think, and that is, how do you actually bring it into the church? It's so far away from most people. And it's actually, it's such a hard problem that we actually, and this will be sort of a shameless plug for the Philos Project, but we developed something. We actually developed this kit. It's a prayer vigil kit, and you can see it at risevigil.org. And the idea is that you bring this kit. It's literally a box with prayer vigil, equipment in it, and reading materials and teaching materials. And it's really, not only do the proceeds go to people on the ground, not only do you get to offer prayer, which as Christians we believe is effective, but it's just a way to kind of introduce this very complicated issue into your church that will lead to those other kinds of advocacy and giving, sort of a transmission belt between knowing nothing and actually doing something.
Parallel to all that's been said, I would simply say, request a meeting with your elected officials, your federal elected officials. Just the fact that you have a meeting or with members or staff will trigger a few helpful things. First, it'll force them to take a position if they don't have a position. Second, they'll look at the legislation that's currently on the table, when they may have not looked at that before. And third, very likely, if you're persistent, you'll force them to make a call to the State Department or the White House to see what they're doing about it, and maybe they'll get back to you. And that multiplied many, many, many times is what moves things.
And one last thing that I'll say, Pastor Fischler, is that the Middle East Christian diaspora communities for the last several years have said it's very important for American Christians, American Christian leaders to engage on this issue. So your presence here and concern is itself very significant. So thank you. I sort of want to ask who's next, and I don't really. Please.
Hello, Andrew.
Hello.
This is Naharan Anwia, a Syrian American activist, and also asking this question on behalf of ANB. As we know, the genocide has started long time ago, not just with ISIS. In a way, sometimes I think to myself that maybe ISIS was a good thing because it really woke up the world to know that an ancient community, not just the cradling of Christianity, but the cradling of civilization was being wiped out, and not too many people knew. I think that the genocides will never end unless these immediate implementations are put in place. And I believe that with a population of less than 300,000 left in that region, it's almost impossible to preserve them for as long as they have existed, for almost 7,000 years. I believe that after placing the semi-autonomous region, or if it's autonomous, the safe haven to preserve their culture, their history, their religion, and everything else with it, just to survive as humans, we would have to eventually create a project just like the Jews did, which I honor and respect and really appreciate how they did it. We need to bring back the Assyrian nation back to their rightful capital of Nineveh, who are also known as Chaldeans and Syriacs. We need to bring these people back to where they started, where they were born. I was born there. I think about it every day. I would like to go back one day, but the people will not return unless they're granted a safe haven, unless they're granted their own military units they can trust. As you know, we were disarmed 2 weeks before ISIS invaded. Nobody knew this, but we knew it because we have people there. And there's a lot of corruption in that region. And the only way is who takes care of a home better than the homeowners? Avoiding the locals right there to avoid them from ethnically and religiously cleansing these people. As you know, Nineveh is one of the most disputed places in the world right now. All the vital resources in those grounds. We have to understand that no matter how someone may pose as our ally or friend, we have to really listen to the people that are not being politically steered or influenced. People like myself, like Juliana, they're people that were born in those regions that are not getting paid by a political party to say what we're saying and really voicing the cries of these people. And also, I believe another way to really preserve these people throughout the entire region, not just in the Nineveh province, would be an indigenous acknowledgement. Native Americans throughout the United States are acknowledged as the natives. Let someone dare to ever ethnically or religiously cleanse a Native American. I believe the Assyrian people in that region need a native acknowledgement all the way from the northern KRG unit, government, to the bottom of the central government of Iraq. There needs to be some sort of new policies to push that. And also international, as you all mentioned, you did all a wonderful job acknowledging the safe haven internationally protected region. But international protection, because as of now, and I think I speak for many of our people, our nation, we do not trust anybody in that region for what has happened to us. Our lands were handed over to ISIS. And especially not just our people, also we have to remember the Yazidis, but we need international protection along with directly empowering our own military units. You know, we have the Nineveh Plains Protection Units, completely independent, not following anyone's particular agenda, you know, comprised of mostly indigenous people. We need to empower them directly. That is the only way to preserve them. And then listen to their people in the diaspora who are not influenced in any way, who are not receiving a check by anyone to say what they're saying. And thank you for IDC also for holding this type of event, because truly, if it wasn't with today's technology, you're right, and I believe Ara mentioned, we will be wiped out in your lifetime if these immediate things are not put in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Nahran. Thank you. Robert, do you want to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with anything you say, and I think that for me, when I first came into this space, trying to think, you know, what can we as the Philos Project, as Americans, as Christians, do to help, you know, Middle Eastern Christians, and I started to learn. Really, the most important thing for me was listening to the people. You know, what do they want? I didn't know. Again, I came into it genuinely wanting to hear what they had to say. So, you know, I've been in quite a few places listening to people like you and even you. I think that there is a consensus around pretty much everything that you've said. And I think that that's very much the direction that, you know, I speak for me, and I think I speak for everybody on the panel, that we all want to go. And I think that, as Aram said, if those things don't happen, it's true that these people will disappear. So full agreement with what you said.
I have a question for you, and that is, what is the best estimate of the size of the diaspora community that you would want under ideal circumstances, under the sort of set of circumstances that you've described, to return, to come back, to rebuild.
The majority of the Assyrians, as you know, we have multiple names due to the many different types of political influences, but the people in general do want to return back home. My family wants to return back home. I speak to refugees and internally displaced people all the time. In fact, there was one that literally escaped ISIS I was speaking to, and she cries every day to my family, and she says, you know, we loved our lives there. Besides the oppressions, we want to return. I would say the majority, if they're given some sort of protection and given some sort of resources to work with, a life and infrastructure. I believe quite a few of you also mentioned that, you know, we keep receiving humanitarian aid. We need infrastructure. You know, these people that are lawyers, doctors, whatever they're doing in the business world, they want to return back home to some sort of career.
Right.
And being natives, you know, we're oppressed for our religion, our history. I believe that they truly want to wipe us out because these are rich lands that they want to take over. And I want to, one day, I don't have any children, but I want to go back home and I want to have my first child there if I'm able to do that. And I believe many women, Assyrian women, want to do this. And but it's just, they're afraid, you know, because we have no security. We have no one we can really trust. As you know, we're constantly persecuted. We've suffered almost 100 genocides. So that's why we are frustrated as a nation.
Thank you, Nahran. We have with us Bayan Abdul Rahman, who is the representative of the Kurdistan Regional Government. So, Madam Representative, can we get a microphone over here?
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank IDC for hosting this event. It gives all of us the opportunity to learn more and to hear more of the concerns of the Christian community. I'd also like to say, beyond genocide, preserving Christianity in the Middle East, this is important to all of us in the Middle East. It's not just the Christian community who want this. We all want to preserve Christianity in the Middle East, and certainly in Iraq and Kurdistan. There are a few points with a question, so if you allow me just a couple of minutes. Many of you talked about a federal Iraq, a fully functioning federal Iraq. This is what the Kurds have been asking for since the 90s, actually, but certainly since 2005, when the Iraqi constitution was ratified and voted for in a referendum. But it's failed. So we need a new kind of federalism that really functions, not federalism that's a piece of paper. And we do need US leadership. We've heard that said in many contexts. I know that the people of America are sick and tired of Iraq. You've given lives, you've given money, you've given political capital, and maybe some of you feel that it's been wasted. But I say to you that when US doesn't intervene, intervention doesn't always mean 100,000 troops. There are 1,000 ways of intervening in a crisis. When the US doesn't intervene, others do. And they don't have your agenda or my agenda. They have their own agenda. So I do ask for US leadership to continue in the Middle East, in Iraq, beyond the liberation of Mosul. Going back to the idea of fully functioning federation, a province for the Christians, for the Yazidis, for the Shabaks, Kakes, I want to quote a Yazidi friend who spoke in Washington in July. He was asked, he was on a panel with some members of the Christian community, and the panel was asked, what is the future of Iraq? What do you think should be the future? And he said, you're asking me? I'm the victim here. I'm the patient, I'm not the doctor. And I think we have to remember that. Of course, we need to listen to what those communities want, but all of us have a responsibility and a duty to participate in the resurrection of Christianity, the preservation of all of these minorities in the Middle East. Again, I'm quoting the same Yazidi friend. He said, one thing I can say is that we cannot allow Iraq to go back to the system that allowed the genocide to happen. I think that's a crucial message from a victim of genocide that all of us should think about. I apologize, I arrived a little late, so I may have missed a part of the discussion, which is my question now. In the discussion so far, I have heard nothing about justice. Maybe I missed it. Why is it that genocides continue to happen in Iraq? They've happened to the Yazidis. We've heard from our friend that they've happened many times to the Christian community. They've happened to the Kurds. They've happened to everybody. Why is it acceptable that Iraq is the theater of massacre, the theater of mass murder over and over again? One of the reasons it happens over again, and I think it will happen again to one of us in Iraq, unless there is justice. The people who are responsible for the most recent genocide against the Christians, the Yazidis, the other minorities, they need to be held to account, whoever they are. There is a big drive among the Yazidis and the KRG to take the case against ISIS to the International Criminal Court. We need US leadership for that. We need international support for that. I don't know where IDC stands on that. We recognize that there needs to be local justice as well. The International Criminal Court will put on trial 3 or 4 people, and it will take a decade. What about the thousands who are involved in rape, in enslavement, in beheadings, in mass murder, in expulsions? They need to be dealt with, sure, at a local level, but even that needs assistance. We need our criminal court system, our prosecutors, our judges, our lawyers to be trained and enabled to prosecute these cases. But we also need an element of international justice. Otherwise, impunity will only lead to another genocide. It'll be you or you or you or me. We need to change the mentality in Iraq, and that does need US leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Representative. Thank you. Do you want to the Aram, please go ahead.
Thank you so very much. When President Truman signed the Genocide Convention in 1948, the document he signed was actually the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, precisely because of the point you made, which is that we punish evil, we punish wrongdoing, because that creates a sounder basis to move forward and to prevent the repetition of the very atrocities we're trying to prevent. It's exactly that cycle of genocide committed with impunity, genocide denied without consequence, and even consolidated without any repercussions that inspires and emboldens every successive new perpetrator of genocide to follow that path. So if we're going to break the cycle in Iraq or anywhere, it'll be based on a just resolution of these crimes, not just by papering them over and hoping that they don't happen again. That's not a sound basis. So perfect point.
And I would also like to just echo what has been said. I think you expressed it so eloquently, and you are absolutely right. It is impossible to change the DNA of a society in which such atrocities happen without that society being prepared to face its history, face it with all of the pain and self-revelation that involves, and a legal accountability is part of that facing of history. And we actually do see the extraordinary difference between societies that have faced their complicity in genocide fully and painfully and those that have not. You know, Germany is a very good example. No country in our reckoning committed a greater or graver genocide than Germany, but there was an unflinching readiness to acknowledge, to face, to atone publicly, privately, through churches, through educational institutions, through the courts. You know, a comprehensive effort, and it was transformative for Germany. A few years ago, I read a very interesting book contrasting that with Russia's unwillingness to face the atrocities of the communist era. And the title of the book was, "It Was a Long Time Ago and It Never Really Happened." And it's a very, very good book, but it talks about the fundamental inability to truly reconcile and heal and move forward without that process. And so I can't tell you how strongly I feel that you are right. And certainly there needs to be a referral of ISIS by the Security Council to the International Criminal Court. But you're right, that's one very important step. That's the one that takes place on the big stage. But it has to be accompanied within Iraq by a readiness to face these historical wrongs in many different ways. And the schools and the educational system have to play their part as well.
Robert?
I think, yeah, thank you, Madam Representative, for saying all of that. And I think, I just want to say one thing, and I think that in thinking about sort of post-ISIS Iraq, I think that there's two things that need to happen at the same time. One is exactly what you said, and that is the sort of punishment of perpetrators. I think that goes without saying. There's no excuse for what ISIS did, and the people who led ISIS should be held to account. At the same time, there is also a need for engaging the Sunni Arabs. And this isn't probably the forum for a deep sort of political discussion, but one of the underlying reasons, again, noting that there's no excuse, one of the underlying reasons for the rise of ISIS is a feeling of Sunni disempowerment. Rightly or wrongly, that is the reality. And I think that there's a danger in being over punitive. You know, we've seen that after World War I in Germany. We saw that even in Iraq with de-Baathification. I think that there's some unintended consequences that came from that sort of maybe overly sweeping punishment. So while we're punishing, I think there's also a need to be addressing those underlying fears, and that's where I think this idea of decentralization and really recognizing the federalism that's already embedded in the Iraqi constitution. It is on paper, as you say. The task now is to make sure that that happens in practice. Easier said than done, but I think to address those underlying grievances, it must be done, or else we're going to have something, we'll have World War II, after World War I.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just a
Tufi?
fast answer, yes.
Yes.
On the ICC issue, it takes time and a lot of effort, and we don't have time. I think we should try to proceed with that, but at the same time, we are in the most powerful country in the world. When anyone, any official, a congressman, a senator, when they say something, the whole world listens. So what we should do, we should press on sanctioning individuals that supported ISIS, that gave money to ISIS, and countries that are doing so. So this is something that we can do, and we should get everyone's help to support us on this.
Thank you, Tawfiq. Juliana.
Thank you. Juliana Taimurazi, Iraqi Christian Relief Council, and the Philos Project. There are about 4 million Assyrian Christians throughout the world, and not all of them will return because of the scars that we've experienced, that we have. However, what ISIS, as Nahran said, what ISIS did in a very demented way, it has awakened a giant called Assyria. And there are many, many, countless of young people that are willing and ready to go back and rebuild. So that is the good news for us as a nation. My appeal to the people in the room, we have many members of the media here. What is gravely missing in the United States, in my humble opinion, I've been in this realm for over 9 years. I've traveled through hundreds of churches, have touched millions of Christians in America, and have come back many times with a broken heart, because I hear in the Christian community, are you really Christians? Were you baptized as an adult, or were you baptized as an infant? So there is an education that is missing among the churchgoers, among the people that are sitting in the pews. And I think that if the media starts writing really about the plight of not just Christians, I think we will miss a very important point if we refer to these victims of genocide just as Christians, because we have an ethnicity, and it's called Assyrian. And it was because of the church divisions that our names are now different, that we're called Chaldeans and Syriacs. So if you would write about the plight of the Assyrian Christians of the Middle East, that would educate America as a whole. And if we educate Americans, and Americans are the most giving people, I know based on my own experience, generation after generation. And if they know what is really happening to their fellow brothers and sisters that were commanded to love because we're members of one body of Christ, they will stand up and they will want to do something about that. But we as activists, all of us on the panel, we have a responsibility, and that is breaking down this giant problem to bite-sized pieces and presenting it to the church people, to the churchgoers. When we say we want them to advocate, an average person in Arkansas doesn't know what to advocate for. And if we don't have a toolkit that we present to the ministers, to the pastors and priests, that really they can take it back to the church family and say, here's what you can do. There's step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. We are failing our fellow brothers and sisters in the Middle East. That's all I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana. Saidna, did you have? Bishop Gregory Mansour, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you to this elegant panel, and it's good to see so many people here from different denominations. As we said in the first time, we had all the different divisions of Christianity, from 431, 451, 1054, the Protestant Reformation, all the different, and they're all present, and they're all working together. And then you have all the different humanitarian efforts, from the Copts to the Assyrians to the people of all parts of the Middle East present. It's beautiful. I just want to say, I think as last year we focused on genocide, the issue, I think we have to follow up specifically on that. And one of the things I would like to is if we can focus on 4 or 5 things. One, the issue of the Copts, Senator Trott, his efforts, and the rest of your efforts. The other on the safe zone for the Nineveh Plains. And I think we do need to follow up with the International Court, just so that genocide is not acceptable. And it was this group, IDC, that brought the Scholars of Catholic University Law School and the Genocide Watch, and several of them together with the Knights of Columbus and other groups. And so I think we need to follow up legally on this matter as well. Not so much to be punishing, but to keep it on the radar so that people realize that this is not acceptable. And lastly, I want to comment on what you said, Andrew. We are not anti-Islam. I would not be a part of a group that is anti-Islam. And because they suffer from this as well. If we can find ways in which we can tell them a message that when Christianity first began, they were persecuted by everybody. And somehow they made their way before it was a state acceptable thing in 300. They made their way all the way to China, India, North Africa, Spain, all of Europe. That was a power of love. And I think if we reach out to our Muslim brothers who are also victims of these criminal gangs hiding behind Islamic, Quranic teaching, I think if we can appeal to them to say, we want to reach out to you. We want to live in peace. We want you to live in peace. We want to prosecute the criminals, and we want to be equal citizens with you. This is not just pious talk. I do think that we get that message out, and I've seen, we are not Democrat or Republican here. We're not pro-Saudi or pro-Iranian here. IDC has done a great job in all the ways in which we brought unity. And I think we've got to continue on that strain. And so I'm so grateful for your efforts and for IDC and for everyone here.
Thank you, Saidna. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid now it's after 5 o'clock and we're being invited to leave. So thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you in the days ahead and working with you as well. Thank you so much.